In the scripture version we read, the sea, which is really a lake, is called the Sea of Galilee. But in the New Revised Standard Version, it is called the Sea of Tiberias. And there's a couple other names which are not important to this moment. But the Sea of Tiberias, calling it this at this point in the story, is something that is curious to me. And one of the reasons that this is one of the names of this lake, this sea, is because there is a town on this lake, this sea, called Tiberias, which was built and named after one of the Herods, Herod Antipas. So this town was named and built for Herod, which, if you know, Herod in our scripture text is always a villain. So why, at this point in the story, are we calling it now the Sea of Tiberias, calling it the name for a villain in the story? And as we're talking about and thinking about borders, right, in this series, borderlands, shorelines, it got me thinking about how one of the things that happens with borders is that they move. Borders move. They often move across land and across people. This is something that happened in the current southwestern United States, right? It used to be Mexico. And then one day, it was no longer Mexico, and it was America, and what soon would become the United States of America. But before that, it was Mexico, and this border moving came with a promise of citizenship, which never came. But a border crossed a people, right? And it crossed a land, and suddenly the place had a different name. This has also happened somewhat recently in a sort of funny way. There is another body of water called the Gulf of, well, depends, right? It depends on who's saying what it's called, right? The Gulf of Mexico got a new name, the Gulf of America. And I think this is actually something, I know, you're saying no. Someone did rename it, right? But there is a resistant force, which I even experience here in this room, to refuse to call it by its new name because there's something more true about what it has been called, right? And there's a power game happening here, a power struggle happening by what we call things. So anyway, I wanted to call your attention to this. There's different names for this sea, and names are often political. So it's important we pay attention when this happens, when these kind of changes happen in the story. So there they are on the Sea of Tiberias, but it's also a shoreline between what we've said, emptiness and fullness, betrayal and integrity, brokenness and reconciliation. And they're also standing on the shoreline between the community that they've gathered and then also managing that community, which are two very different tasks. On the edge of this sea, which is really a lake, that was once Peter's livelihood while he was still Simon, right, where he conducted his fishing business, thriving fishing business, before being called to fish for people by Jesus. Peter eats breakfast here with his resurrected rabbi. There's a picture that I've put up. This is a picture I took on this lake where I stood and imagined them having breakfast. This is our setting for the day. The lake of Galilee, the Sea of Galilee, rocky shore. And during our prayer time, if you want to come up and see some of the sand from this beach, you can. It's right up here. So during this meal here on the lake shore, Jesus harkens back to several moments throughout their relationship, starting with Simon Peter's call. It was then, too, that there was a miraculous catch of fish, which we've mentioned, after pulling in empty nets again and again and again. Simon Peter is reminded of his initial call in this meal, his initial call to fish for people. And again, he sees the miraculous power of Christ as a multitude of fish are again drawn aboard. Remember. By the time the fishing disciples also get to shore, Jesus has lit a charcoal fire, reminding Peter of another charcoal fire. Do you all remember when there is a charcoal fire in the story? You got to shout it out if you remember. Well, yep, so that's in this story. But before this story, there's a charcoal fire burning when Peter denies Jesus. So Jesus has been arrested, is in the courts of the high priests, and there is a charcoal fire burning in a courtyard that Peter is standing around. And he's asked 3 times, "Aren't you a disciple of that Galilean? You have a Galilean accent. Aren't you Galilean? Aren't you a disciple of Christ?" And each time he says no. He denies him 3 times around a charcoal fire. So as he comes to shore, Jesus has a charcoal fire burning. The sea is also the place that Peter, as we talked about last week, stepped out onto stormy waters, identifying Christ, making sure it was Christ by requesting that Jesus invite him into bravery at great personal risk. So it is on the shore of this storied sea, the sea that is really a center point in Jesus and Peter's relationship and in Peter's story in general, where they break bread together around a charcoal fire and calling to mind another meal that they celebrated just a few nights before. Do you remember what holiday they would have celebrated? Passover. Good job. So they celebrated Passover just a few nights before, which becomes for us, for Christians, the Last Supper, right? The Last Supper that Jesus eats with his disciples. And this is where the institution of the sacrament of communion comes into play, where it is instituted, when Jesus gives the disciples a new commandment to love one another. This moment toward the end of Jesus' time here on earth, this is post-resurrection but pre-ascension, right? So we're really at the end of Jesus' time here on earth, and this moment, Jesus seems to pull some sort of string of meaning through Jesus and Peter's entire relationship, the entirety of Peter's discipleship under Jesus. If this were a movie, there'd be a montage of images flashing through the whole story, reminding the viewer of everything that has brought them to this point. And I actually think it's funny, but I actually do think this is the right way to think about it. The Gospel of John was likely the last gospel written years, maybe decades after the others. The movement of Jesus' way is growing around the known world, and John is writing to help this growing movement understand who Jesus is and what Jesus is calling the church to do and to be. This story is more for us than it is even for Peter. I think that we are supposed to make our way to this shoreline, to find one of those stones to sit on and sit down with the disciples around the charcoal fire, sit there next to Thomas and Nathanael and the sons of Zebedee and Jesus' favorite disciple, John, who wrote this himself. And to hear this exchange, I think we're invited to sit here and listen in on this exchange, which is not only a message to Peter, but as a message and an invitation to all of us who continue this story. Reminding Peter of all that has happened, all that's come before, Jesus makes clear what Peter has been prepared to do. Makes it clear that Jesus has been preparing him. If it wasn't clear then, it should be clear now. Jesus was preparing Peter for something. And as he is making this clear, he also makes clear what harm Peter needs to repair after having denied him 3 times, and provides Peter an opportunity to decide whether this is the story that he would like to continue. It is a sort of ordination. It's a time where vows need to be made, or your vocational direction must shift. It's a decision point for Peter. After all that he's seen, after all that has been, right? There's been a rupture, and there's been a death, and there's been a resurrection. After all that he has seen, does Peter want to keep walking down this road? Does he want to start the next leg of the journey? So there's this exchange over breakfast of a threefold affirmation of faith, because Peter needed to reconcile, right? Needed to make right with the person who he denied 3 times. And perhaps all transitions in life are like this, requiring some reconciliation and healing of what has been done in the ebbing tide so that a new tide can flow. More than repairing the broken relationship, the disciples also eat a meal of fish and bread, replenishing their bodies and spirits in preparation for what is to come, for the rising tide, a movement of Christian communities sprouting up all across the known world, loving the world into radical change, disrupting the established order out of faithfulness, and costing many of them their lives, including Peter. The journey ahead is going to require nourishment. It's going to require a warm meal to comfort the spirit and fuel the flesh, and the care of a community to feed their hearts in order that they might all face the future unafraid. But more than just reconciliation, Jesus' threefold charge is different than we've heard before for Peter and the disciples. This is a new invitation. I would expect him to say, "Do you love me? Fish for people." But instead, we hear, what? Feed my lambs, take care of my sheep. Take care of my sheep. But Peter is a fisherman. They were literally moments earlier fishing. They were actively fishing. They were back to their old business after sort of washing out as fishers of people for a guy who died. But Jesus surprises us here at breakfast. Jesus surprises the church who is now sitting on the stones around him. Remember, this message is for us. And so what does he say? He says, "Take care of my sheep." There's a company out there right now that is selling shirts. You may have seen them around that seem vaguely Christian-esque, as many things are right now. The company is called, and many of the shirts say, "Lions, not sheep," to give you a sense of their values. Other shirts say, "Mostly peaceful." And even others have machine guns on them with the saying, "Lead or be led." And another that says, "Give violence a chance." I know. This company comes out of this toxic hyper masculinity that is surging right now, where the idea is that being helpful or kind or having empathy for other people is seen as weak and even sinful. It's womanly, so it's weak, and so the charge is to not be sheep, which is sort of unfortunately the same conclusion that Jesus draws in this story. Don't be sheep. But the values, that undergird this conclusion and the actions that Jesus wants to come out as a result of this conclusion are very different from the lions, not sheep crowd. The lions, not sheep crowd says, don't be sheep, be a lion. Become the predator. Become the king of the jungle. But Jesus says, you, disciples, don't be sheep any longer. Become a shepherd. Take care of the sheep. Go find the lost sheep. Lay down your lives for the sheep. Give yourselves up. Give yourselves up to the authorities to protect the sheep from them. Lay at the gate of the sheep pen with your own body and protect them from the wolves and the lions. Even though there's not lions in Galilee, but there probably are in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa where the disciples were sent out, right? Okay, the metaphor works and holds. Okay. And though it is part of the same mission that Peter was originally called to, Peter's call shifts focus here, or at least he shifts roles in the movement from fishing for people, right? From being an evangelist to taking care of Jesus's sheep. By this time, after Jesus' ministry is coming to completion and he is resurrected, there has been a miraculous catch of people Maybe 153 of them, or maybe now there were 153 churches planted across the known world. But there is a net full of Christ followers who have strangely and miraculously become sheep to the Good Shepherd. At this shoreline, Jesus calls Peter again to change his role, transforming from a fisher to a shepherd. And when we think about when John is writing, even later as the church is facing persecution, the message for the church is to shift their focus. It's not necessary right now in the midst of persecution to go out and fish for people, to make yourself vulnerable in that way. Instead, the task of the moment for the church at John's time is to take care of the sheep. Both the ones already in the pen and the ones who have gotten lost or gone astray or been stolen or who have just not found their place yet. By going out and fishing, John and Jesus still leading them, right? So the disciples going out and fishing just before this moment, and Jesus still directing them what to do. This is even after his betrayal, after his arrest, after his death and resurrection, right? The guy's been through it. The disciples are still behaving as though they're sheep in the pen where Jesus is the good shepherd, which is fine for as long as Jesus is with them. But Jesus is about to ascend to heaven. He won't be with them much longer. There can't only be sheep. There need to be shepherds. And it's clear that Peter is, like in this story, being called specifically to become a shepherd in a particular way. We know that Peter becomes the head of the church. He will serve as what we call the church's first pope. But the other disciples, and us sitting there with them, are also being called to not be stagnant in our own discipleship, happy and content with being sheep. From as far back as the book of Exodus, the scriptures tell us that God's imagination for us, God's plan for us, is that we will be a kingdom of priests. And as late as 1 Peter, a letter attributed to Peter, though we don't know that he wrote it, this Peter in our story, our scriptures say, "But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, in order that you may proclaim the excellence of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." It has always been the plan for every single one of us gathered here, for every single one who's ever been gathered in a place like this one, to see ourselves as leaders, as caretakers, as conduits of God's grace in the world, as evangelists, as disciples, and as disciplers, as a kingdom of priests, a flock of shepherds, if you will. And so Christ asks us, do you love me? What say you, church? Do you love Christ? Then take care of Christ's sheep. Disciples, do you love Jesus? Then take care of Christ's lambs. Church, do you love Jesus? Then become shepherds. Take care of the sheep. May it be so.